Good evening and welcome. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Life on campus, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you tonight to the J. Edward Farnham Lecture Series, to this lecture tonight, Writing Life, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Jewish Life, the English Department, and the Comp Lit Department. Tonight we are here to celebrate the writing of Jonathan Safran Foer, one of the most controversial and influential writers of our time. One of our own, this Jewish-American writer is a Princeton alum from the class of 1999. While an undergraduate, Jonathan pitched the idea of traveling to Ukraine in search of the woman who may or may not have saved his grandfather's life during the Holocaust, and he funded this trip by making a pitch of the idea to a group of Princeton alumni, one of whom generously stepped forward to fund this adventure that became his first novel, Everything is Illuminated. Under the guidance of his teacher, Joyce Carol Oates, and Jeff Eugenides, Jonathan worked and reworked his manuscript in a small Carroll and Firestone library as a part of his senior thesis. He is here tonight because the book earned the National Jewish Book Award, the Guardian Book Award, and now has been published in at least 24 countries. But he is also here tonight because he didn't give up after the first 14 publishers said no, and because he was willing, as he encouraged a student earlier today, to call himself a writer. I learned this morning in a writing workshop Jonathan facilitated at the Center for Jewish Life that he believes one should only write out of necessity. Perhaps this explains in part why Jonathan endeavors to tackle daunting topics such as the Holocaust and September 11th, the subject of his second novel, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which is soon to be released as a major motion picture. In addition to a third novel, The Tree of Codes, Jonathan has written a book of nonfiction, Eating Animals, detailing his own conversion to vegetarianism and arguments against eating meat. His new American Haggadah for the Passover Seder will be published in 2012. Jonathan explained that odds are his work will increasingly be Jewish, because when he writes from his most authentic particularity, he best relates to the commonalities we all share as people. For me as a reader, what distinguishes Foer's work is his ability to combine an authentic Jewish sensibility of tragic comedy with fantastical elements and extended metaphors that inspire in me moments of radical amazement. There are elements of his books that I don't understand or that I wonder about, revealing, I believe, glimpses of the undergraduate philosophy major and reminding me that part of being human is sensing the profound and ultimately accepting it as a mystery. Tonight is also a celebration of the student-teacher relationships that define Princeton. Joyce Carol Oates was one of Jonathan's creative writing professors. She commented to me, "I like to think that I immediately recognized his talent, but I'm sure that any other writing teacher would have also in my place. He is enormously gifted and very imaginative and industrious." Industrious is quite a compliment from Joyce Carol Oates. She has written prolifically since her first novel, With Shuddering Fall, was published in 1964. I endeavored to read all of Jonathan's books before this evening's introduction, but I never could have completed Joyce Carol Oates' works, which include over 50 novels, as well as many volumes of short stories, poetry, and nonfiction. Her novel, Them, won the National Book Award, and her novels Black Water, What I Lived For, and Blonde were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. As of 2008, Joyce Carol Oates is the Roger S. Berlin Class of 52 Professor in the Humanities with the program in Creative Writing at Princeton University, where she has taught since 1978. The conversation that will take place in a moment between student and teacher, between writers and friends, reminds me of one of my favorite Jewish teachings found in Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia says, "Make for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a friend." As we prepare to give a warm round of applause, I want to evoke an extended metaphor from Jonathan's work that made me pause in the middle of reading with a sense of wow and curiosity. quote, I went to a tattoo parlor and had yes written onto the palm of my left hand and no onto my right palm. What can I say? It hasn't made life wonderful. It's made it possible. When I rub my hands together in the middle of winter, I am warming myself with the friction of yes and no. When I clap my hands, I am showing my appreciation through the uniting and the parting of yes and no. I signify book by peeling open my clapped hands. Every book for me is the balance of yes and no. Let's put our hands together for a warm round of applause for Jonathan Safran Foer and Joyce Carol Oates.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Jonathan and I are going to have some sort of a fantasy that we're speaking in very casual, almost like privately, and people can listen. And then maybe after about 50 minutes, or when we run out of ideas, which may be much earlier, we'd like to open it to the audience, and some of the most exciting ideas do come from an audience. Jonathan has been confronting questions all day long, and he was in my workshop this afternoon. It was very lively and very exciting, and to me, very surprising, some of the things that Jonathan said. Of course, he maybe doesn't remember what he said, and so you have to make up something new. But I'd just like to begin by saying I actually was quite, well, the number of things that you said today I was really surprised at, so I just ask you to kind of enhance them or to expand them a little. Many writers plan things obsessively, and they do research, and they take notes, sometimes for months or even years. They make up outlines. You hear about writers who have maps on the wall and outlines and chronological lines and so forth. But you said today in answer to a student's question that you didn't really know when you began what you were going to do. And I found that I found it astonishing and kind of exciting and in a way thrilling to know that one could just begin and have the results that you do.
Well, thank you for coming, first of all, to everybody who's here. I went to many, many readings and public conversations when I was a student, and can even remember, if not the specific seat, then at least very close to the seats where I sat. So it's strange and exciting, obviously, to be on the stage. And thank you to those who brought me here. And most warmly, thank you, Joyce, for doing this for me. And this is more than this conversation. When I entered Joyce's class, in the very beginning of I'm going to keep this short because it will embarrass Joyce, and I don't know that she'll even like it, but it's true and necessary. When I entered Joyce's class as a freshman, I had no ambitions of becoming a writer. And she found me one afternoon before class. We both arrived early, and said verbatim, "I'm very glad to have a moment to speak with you outside of the context of class. I wanted to tell you that I'm a fan of your writing." And it was just a real revelatory moment in my life, and we're lucky to have in our lives, a small handful of those. And it was revelatory not only because this author who I so admired would say something kind about my writing, but because it literally hadn't occurred to me at that point that there was such a thing as my writing. I just didn't know that existed in the world. And being told that it did was really life-altering, so thank you for that. To the question of planning, I became a writer largely because, and I don't mean this as a joke, largely because I didn't want to become anything else. I at a certain point, because I was a student in an American university, was really forced to figure out an answer to the future question, what do you do? And I didn't like the answers that I could think of. And I thought of quite a few when I was a student. I thought I might become, I should say I didn't like them for me. I had thought of becoming a psychology major. I had thought of being pre-med. I was a philosophy major. That's something I might have continued with. But I didn't like the idea of being constrained. I'm sure that psychologists and philosophers don't feel constrained. But when I imagine myself doing anything other than writing, I always imagine myself wanting to stretch in ways that I wouldn't be able to. So I tried writing. And in writing, when I would plan my work, which I used to do really energetically, I felt constrained. Not in the planning, but in the actual writing. I started to feel like a craftsman, which is exactly what I never wanted to feel like. I wanted to feel like an adventurer, like a great explorer. And I learned fairly quickly that without the energy of that freedom fueling the process, I would just run out of steam. And I've run out of steam on many, many books, as I'm sure you have, or I imagine you have.
Not really.
Yeah, actually, as I was saying it, I thought you probably haven't.
I don't believe in giving I don't believe in giving up. I think there's something frightening and disintegrating about giving up. If you give up one project, you might give up another. But just to touch upon what you're saying, there are many writers who have to have a destination. It's like you start off in a car and you need a destination, but you can choose the route of getting there. It can be very imaginative and unusual. But another way of writing or creating art is to just start off on an adventure. And I think that's riskier. It does expand you more, but there's more areas for anxiety, I would think.
Well, I think it's really only risky if you're excited about your own potential, which I've never really been. I am excited by the idea of exceeding my own potential. So if I were to, which I think art can allow one to do, to reach destinations that your human vehicle in the world is not capable of reaching. So how do you do it? You have to set yourself up so that make accidents possible, make fortuity possible, encourage these things so that you can become good at recognizing the slight error that sends you off in a direction that's more interesting than the one you might have planned. Earlier we were talking about something Joseph Brodsky said, the rhyme is smarter than the poet. And so, poets write in verse not only because it can sound quite beautiful, but because when you create for yourself a problem, the solution is often more interesting than what you would have done if you'd been unconstrained. So my preferred method, or what has worked for me so far, when I say worked, I only mean it's allowed me to reach the end of books, is to overwrite, to write many, many more pages than I will keep, and to then look at them and try to decide what these pages have in common, if they belong together. Jackson Pollock, I think only toward the end of his life, used to unroll huge swaths of canvas, like 10 yards by 30 or 40 yards, and paint the whole area. And then when the painting was done, would walk on the canvas and say, well, this looks like a 3x5 painting, and this looks like maybe a small 2x2, and that's a little bit what my process is like. I put out a lot, and then I try to figure out what is worth keeping. And then there's editing, which is not at all like composing, when I make use of, and when it is quite deliberate. And then at that point, I might make outlines, or try to make sure that the balance feels good, and that there's the appropriate symmetries, the things that are necessary to keep a reader. It's one thing to write something that you want to write. It's another thing to write something a reader would want to read. And I am a writer who wants to share what I write with others, so there's a second half of the process.
Well, when you were an undergraduate student, you were very experimental, more than most students. And I think that experimental dimension in you is something that's playful and unpredictable, and that's part of why you write, because you don't really know what you're going to do. It's going to be something a little different, something that will be unconventional. And maybe you're related to the visual arts. The visual arts tend to be extremely experimental, like in the 20th century. speaking of Jackson Pollock, for instance. Pollock, however, created a kind of art that would allow his own talent to effloresce. If he had been in a more traditional school, so to speak, he would not have flowered because he probably couldn't draw. He probably couldn't do all the conventional things that one would seem to have to do, you know, little watercolors and so forth. So he sort of created a whole genre of a different kind of action painting that allowed his inability to do a conventional kind of art sort of allowed to express himself in a new way. And I thought that was always very interesting about Pollock, that maybe this is true of genius. Genius can't do this because other people have done it, and genius is not excited by it, so genius has to go in some new, somewhat raw and uncultivated area.
There's a wonderful essay that John Ashbery wrote about Jackson Pollock and about the avant-garde more generally, where he says, you know, imagine Pollock when he was doing those first strip paintings and what he must have thought. He must have thought, there are really only two possibilities. I'm the greatest painter in America, or I'm not a painter.
I'm a complete failure, yeah.
You could not be a mediocre painter making those paintings. And he said that's what's so thrilling about looking at them. Whoever you are, you have for an instant wondered if they are complete bullshit. Everyone has wondered that. And that is the thrill of the all-or-nothing wager. And in the essay, Ashbery makes an analogy, the obvious analogy, to religion. You know, God exists or God doesn't exist, by whatever your, you know, definition of God's existence is. And, but taking, let's say, a very, very traditional one. If God were to reveal himself, come down and ask everyone to pray, presumably everybody would, you know, if the plea were persuasive enough. But Ashbery says what's beautiful about religious faith would be completely lost, which is the all-or-nothing wager. And that is what avant-garde art, but art probably more broadly always aspires to, is a kind of standing on an uncertain, you know, standing on a fence between something that is terrific and something that is terrible.
Well, art that we call avant-garde comes before its time, basically. So someone like Franz Kafka, for instance, to us seems like a classic, and we can read him and understand him, but contemporary readers at that time would not have been able to understand him. Or the paintings of Cézanne, or the poetry of Emily Dickinson. And Jackson Pollock is an obvious example, too. And so it's as if these people come into the world and their art is so extraordinary that most people won't like it. People are always saying, it's like a cliche, they come in the museum, they see Jackson Pollock, my 2-year-old could do better than this. You know, it's a cliche. But then as time goes on, these extraordinary works of art start to educate people. And so at a certain point, they become classics. And now when you see Pollock, he looks like a classic on the wall in the museum. And his contemporaries, or his older contemporaries, now seem very old-fashioned. It's as if he's sort of redefined what art is. But there's another side of your writing, too. You are naturally experimental and unpredictable, but I think you also have a very deeply traditional, sentimental heart, in that you love people, and you love characters, and you love bringing people together, like the yes and no and the hands and the clapping together. When I heard that read, it's actually very beautiful, and it's really like poetry. And but that springs from a character with some psychological depth.
Yeah, maybe to a fault. I mean, when I look back at the things that I've written that you know, I would like to, after I say a bit here, I want to ask you the same question. When I look back at my writing, which isn't very often, it's basically only when I have to.
Of course, only when you're being interviewed.
Yeah. There are always things that embarrass me. And I think that more often than not, they are the more sentimental moments. It's not to say that I'm still drawn to them when I write. It's not that I would, you know, there are a lot of things that I would do differently, and I'm not sure that that's one of them, but I know that I sometimes get a slightly creepy feeling when reading about love that I have written. It may be that love generally doesn't survive a second reading very well.
It's very difficult to write about these old truths. It's very difficult to write about.
And when you look back at your books when you have to, are there things that, are there things across books that you regret?
Well, looking back upon one's life is always a vertiginous experience. And it would take a long time to answer that. It's really a very probing and difficult question to answer. I tend to think of writing as a series of very exciting, almost overwhelmingly thrilling and challenging episodes. Not unlike a play by Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare had that dramatist sense of the adrenaline flowing. Like, he's going to set a scene, he'll have the three witches, he has Macbeth come in, and he's going to get it all ready, and then in a scene from there he's going to have a bloody murder. And then a little later he's going to have another murder, and he's going to have a wonderful soliloquy, and it's sort of all this thrillingness of the drama when you embark upon a Shakespearean play, you sort of start on that voyage with him. And I would say that my sense of writing is like that. I started with some people who seem to be meritorious and interesting, but maybe don't know themselves completely, and I don't know them completely either. So you sort of put them together, and then what kind of adventures will evolve out of that? To me, that's very exciting, and so I look back and see I've done it in different ways. And to me, that's the sort of pulse beat of literature or of art, is these conflicts and then resolutions, and also people meeting one another. And it may be that your generation, or my generation too, that people are actually afraid of being accused of being sentimental. Even though in our actual lives we are always sentimental, and we love people, and we cry, and we would be devastated if our dog got killed or our cat. But yet when you come to your writing, it's almost only in children's literature can you be overt about these things.
Why do you think that is?
Because the 20th century and now the 21st century is a time of irony. Dickens and Dostoevsky could end their novels in ways we would consider sentimental. Remember, the ending of Crime and Punishment is so different from most of the novel, ending of Dickens. The wonderful scenes where Raskolnikov throws himself down and kisses the earth that he has defiled, or he declares love for Sonia. This kind of writing just doesn't have a contemporary air to it. I guess it's a Joycean revolution in taking the genres and sort of parodying them. But I think it's a loss, and so we've sort of sacrificed to the memoir. That's a very big genre now. The novel has become so self-conscious, and after Nabokov, so self-reflexive, that there's some things that are so raw and painful that only the memoir can really deal with them now. You've written something like a memoir. I think Eating Animals is something like a memoir.
In certain ways. I mean, it's a record of an experience, and it's also the record of my changing thoughts. I prefer it to be read that way than as an argument. I don't really think of it as an argument, although I can understand why a reader might take it as a challenge.
Well, it's really a memoir, and I remember reading it in galleys, and I was so struck by it. I thought it was really wonderful. I think Eating Animals is really a great book. And then it has this other dimension where you wanted to investigate what you're actually putting in your body, and then you had your first child, and what are you feeding this child, you know? It's so existential, not just an idea, but actual food that's coming into one's body. And then you take yourself out to the notorious factory farms and actually seeing things and interviewing people. You might want to talk a little bit about that. You didn't talk too much about that in my class.
Mm-hmm. You asked me at dinner for how long when I became a vegetarian.
Yeah.
I think I said which time. I've become a vegetarian maybe 20 times in my life.
Really? What was the first
Mark
time?
Twain said that the easiest thing in the world to do is to quit smoking. You know, he'd done it 20 times. I first became a vegetarian when I was, I think, 9, and in the way that you would imagine a 9-year-old would. Just.
Anyone else in your family?
No. No, just one very attractive babysitter who made the case. So, you know, I think most people, but especially most children, have some amount of discomfort with the idea of killing animals. There's never been, to my knowledge, a culture in human history that's had a perfectly laissez-faire attitude toward animal slaughter and eating animals. There have always been some kinds of regulations, some rituals, some story involved. So, you know, we find ways to get around it. Maybe the instinct is naive, maybe it's foolish, maybe it's not worth holding on to. For whatever reason, I couldn't completely let go of that instinct, even though I ate meat for most of my youth. But as I said, I would have these periods when I would say, you know what, I was right to think that this is problematic and maybe even wrong, and I'll just play it safe and not get involved with it. I never bothered to do any real research. I didn't read too much about it. I certainly didn't go to a factory farm. Then when my wife became pregnant, the question took on a kind of urgency, because feeding your kid is just not like feeding yourself. It matters a lot more. I remember I wrote an email to a philosophy professor of mine, and I said, just out of curiosity, what's the philosophical defense of factory farming? Not of meat, because my book really isn't about meat, and I think the question of is meat right or wrong is largely irrelevant question right now, given that 99% of the meat we eat comes from factory farms. So I asked, what's the philosophical defense of factory farming? And he said, there isn't a philosophical defense of factory farming. And then I became more curious and started making more phone calls and reading more books and realizing that I had to see these things for myself. And as it turns out, it's very, very difficult to see these things for oneself. I don't think there's any industry in America, with the possible exception of, you know, the weapons industry, that is as secretive as the meat industry is. And you really don't have to believe me. You should go to your local supermarket, open your refrigerator, take out a package of meat, and place a phone call, and just ask what should be make what should be a very reasonable request. Can I learn a little bit about this food? And you'll be met with silence or some kind of they'll point you in a unhelpful direction. So I ended up befriending some animal rights activists who took me along on these middle-of-the-night adventures, all of which were legal, and all of which were really scary. And they told me what I already knew, but they you know, a photograph that you take is different than a photograph that someone else has taken that you look at. And I found it very, very difficult to forget what I'd seen, especially when I came to terms with how unexceptional what I'd seen was. You know, the breadth and depth of this really destructive industry. And when I say destructive, I don't just mean in terms of animal welfare, but the environment. It's the worst thing that it's. The UN has said it's the #1 cause of global warming, one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet. So, am I someone who is capable of living hypocritically? Very much so, all the time, many times a day. Did this feel like a place where I could live less hypocritically? I still live, you know, my eating habits are wildly hypocritical still, and wildly uneven, but I wanted to get it a little more right, and by right I mean I wanted to feel more comfortable in the way that my choices were reflecting my values, and also were reflecting the stories that we told my son, or have come to tell my son, about what it means to be a decent person in the world, a careful person.
Are your feelings about animal rights, for instance, about the same as Peter Singer's?
I don't think about animal rights very often. It's not all that relevant to my way of thinking about things. I think about animal welfare.
Animal welfare.
I think, you know, first of all, people talk about animal rights as if they are a radical idea. Animals have lots of rights presently. The problem is that very few of them are enforced. But Peter Singer is I think reading Peter Singer in America right now is a little bit like reading J.D. Salinger. You know, it is a rite of passage, and there are very few high school students or college students who do not read Animal Liberation at some point and who aren't moved by it. It's a very, very persuasive book. I don't agree entirely with his way of thinking, but I'm glad that he and the book exist.
Peter's point, I think, is sort of an ethical one, that we're all animals. And if you say the animals are over here and human beings are here, that's a mistake, you know. It's illogical. So the idea of eating animals is something that has an ethical component to it. But I think Peter also focuses mostly on the factory farms, and that if the animals are treated reasonably well, as they may have been on small farms, and then they're slaughtered, like the last hour of their life is terrible, but before that they had a good life, I don't think he would feel that that was so unethical as these terrible farms where they never have 1 minute of a life. And then you make the point also that it's unhealthy for the people who eat it as well, and also for the people who work there. Some of the most grisly parts of the book are the people working in these places. So like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, if you remember that. But was that about like 1912 or so?
He said of that book, I aimed for their hearts and I hit their stomachs.
Hit their stomachs, yes.
It was not supposed to be a book against meat per se,
Yes.
but it very much had that effect.
Maybe some of you have not read The Jungle, but it was written by Upton Sinclair when he actually lived in Princeton. He lived about 2 miles from here in a little cabin off Rosedale Road. He was quite young. He was just in his 20s. He had done research in Chicago in the slaughterhouses, and he saw things that were so appalling and so disgusting that he wanted to write about them. And basically it was, as you say, he wanted to aim at the hearts of America, but he hit the stomachs instead. People read about how sausages are made. You don't want to know how sausages are made. Even if you plan to never eat a sausage, you still don't want to know how a sausage is made. And there are these wonderful scenes, and The Jungle is a novel, incidentally. I used to teach it here at Princeton, actually. It's a wonderful novel. It's about the exploitation of workers, of immigrant workers, as well as the exploitation of animals and so forth. But to make a long story short, these people are making lard. There's this vat of horrible stuff that's boiling. And I was almost going to say cats. Cows' tails, everything with the cow is put in there. And then some rats fall in, and rats' tails and whiskers. And they're kind of sweeping everything into this vat of lard that's going to go out onto people's tables and people putting on their toast. But the worst part of it is a man is up on the beam and he's sweeping and doing all this stuff, and the man falls in the vat. And so the human being is all boiled up. And Sinclair speaks about how it all gets packaged and sent out all across America and winds up on your breakfast table. And that's what upset people. It wasn't that they cared about the animals, but they didn't want to be cannibals and eating rats' tails and so forth. I have to say, though, apart from with Peter Singer and Jonathan Foer writing, I think, very brave books and very persuasive books, people get so angry at these books. You'd think that you had written Mein Kampf. You'd think it was Charles Manson's memoir or something.
Right.
Instead of really wonderful, ethical, serious books, people get so angry at you. It's shocking.
But the anger is itself, revealing.
Yeah.
As happens at many readings that I give from Eating Animals, someone will stand up in the Q&A section and say, "Who do you think you are?" Blah, 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 blah. Get all
what are you
heated.
wearing? You probably have leather on your shoes or something. Which I guess you don't.
I don't, but that's another. It's another story, actually, which we'll leave as another story. But I will always say to the person, "Well, obviously we agree that this matters, because otherwise you wouldn't be so upset right now." If I said you should change the kind of Kleenex you use, because the one you use doesn't moisturize your skin, and it's bad for the environment, and you know how the workers who made those Kleenexes are treated. You could say you're an idiot. You could say I'm going to ignore you, but you wouldn't get upset.
No.
And the particular ways that people get upset when having this conversation, the frequency with which it becomes heated, suggests that at least there is one very broad consensus, which is that this matters. There's something of significance is happening, and that's I think what I was gesturing at when I said there's never been a culture that was perfectly laissez-faire about this. It's very hard to pretend that it doesn't matter. That's something.
It's too much. Yeah. You were on the Colbert Show, which I happened to see the segment that you were on, and I thought that he treated you fairly well. And he allowed you to speak clearly and to set forth your ideas. But then at the end, he comes in with this idiotic comic thing where a big plate of bacon. And he starts eating this bacon, and Jonathan says, sort of mischievously, he says, "That's not even good bacon, it's not crisp, it's all kind of lardy and limp." And when I saw that, I thought that's so typical that people can't take a serious moral, ethical question without trying to make it a joke, and the whole thing just seemed to fall flat. I mean, you were wonderful, but I thought that he seemed very foolish in what he had to try to undercut the whole idea of the seriousness.
Well, he's a professional fool, right? That's what he does.
Yeah.
I thought he was as generous as he could possibly be within his character. I was actually surprised by how fair he was and how much time he gave me to talk.
Basically, he's on your side, and so he's playing this right-wing idiot. No, he should run for Republican candidate. I think they need a little more intellect in their debates, let's say. But I don't want to get into politics, however. Let's sort of skitter away from that, but talk about the idea you mentioned a minute ago about the seriousness of eating. And eating and food always have some sort of ritualistic component, because you're breaking bread with people, you're sitting and having meals together, and it's a friendly thing, and Thanksgiving is coming up soon. So we have to think that there's some other psychological, spiritual dimension to it. It's a kind of a religious, ritualistic thing. That's why people get so angry.
Yeah, I think it's bound up with their senses of themselves, the stories their parents told them, the stories their grandparents told them. This is what they work all day so that they can feed the family, and to say that you're organizing your family life, you're organizing your family ritual, your family mythology around what? Around torture, around destruction. It's a very challenging thing to say.
Well, it used to be that people did raise their own food, and they may have hunted, and then they ate the food that they killed. So it had to have a ritualistic component and would seem to be like a natural narrative. Now it's very different. And one wonders why is religion so bound up with eating and rituals of eating? What is so important? Why does God seem to care so much what you eat, and whether you eat it mixed in with other food, or on Friday or on Sunday? Like, what is there about a deity that would make the micromanagement of eating so important? Do you have any ideas about that?
I'm sure there are people in this audience who have much more sophisticated ideas about it, but I mean, part of it is the table is a natural place to locate values.
The family.
It's where we gather to tell each other stories. It's one of the real crimes, I think, of factory farming is not only how it's changed the food that we eat, but how we value food and how we actually eat food. The percentage of meals that we eat in cars is really scary. The percentage of meals that we eat with the fingers of one hand.
Really?
It's really scary while walking. And what happens is food has become so cheap that it is now cheap, emotionally to us. It is very hard to. We've been encouraged to think of a meal as something that is better when done more quickly and better when done less expensively. It used to be that. Americans now eat 180 times as much chicken per person as we did a century ago.
Really?
And it used to be the case that a chicken was a special thing that was roasted in an oven over the course of probably a fair amount of time and eaten at a set table with silverware with the family around. And
I've covered chicken farm. So you don't just eat the chicken. You have to kill the chicken, which is not fun. But then the worst thing is you have to take off the feathers. You know, it's a whole thing that you did. But now it just comes in this cellophane. And it's all bloated with hormones and unspeakable additives.
so we've developed this new attitude about food, and we eat it to get full. And I think what's been taken from us is the idea that we would prepare food ourselves, that would take time, that we might prepare it with others, that we would put care into it, that we would enjoy a meal over some period of time, that again a kitchen table would be the site of the transmission of values and conversation. You know, where is it happening if it's not happening at the table? Where is it that people learn about one another if not at the table? I can't think of where it would be.
Yeah.
It's not, you know, and what are we replacing that with, you know, that time?
Well, people may be eating at their computers or watching television or something, but the family dinner table has been the sort of the nexus of anxiety also, where any number of plays by Eugene O'Neill or somebody, you're set at the table and people are having awful experiences. Well, to move away from this, maybe people have some questions a little later, to go in the opposite direction towards the very esoteric. I was so taken with Jonathan's most recent book, which is called The Tree of Codes. And some of you probably know about it, but maybe most of you don't. So do you want to introduce it a little? And I actually have the book here, which I'll...
We could pass it around.
No, we're not going to...
I'm sure nothing will happen to
somewhere.
it.
The reason I have it is because it's actually an artifact. It's not a book that you would get on Kindle.
I was really interested in a technique called die cutting, which has been around in industry for a very, very long time, a couple hundred years. And
You want to sort of... Nobody can see this, but it's been die cut. You can explain what die cutting is.
is there some extremely attractive student who wants to walk across the stage with a book?
But it's fascinating to look at this book, which is a work of art.
So die cutting is basically removing material from material, and you can do really interesting things with it, especially with paper. And I had for a long time wanted to compose a book by erasing another book, and I ended up using Street of Crocodiles, Bruno Schulz's Street of Crocodiles, which has been one of my favorite books, but also I thought it was a good book to choose for this because
It's short.
it's short, because of the way that he writes. It's a very flowery, ornate, sort of jam-packed sentences that we're going to offer a quite vibrant palette.
And very obsessive. Focused inward, like poetry.
Very much like poetry. And so this was the product.
There's some interesting videos you can look up on the internet of how this book was made.
Yeah, they're really fun to watch. In
They're
certain
fun to
ways,
watch, yeah.
what you would have said in class when I was your student is, in certain ways, the videos are more fun than the book.
No, the book is read in such an interesting way. Well, I'm always, my students, if there are any students in the room, you know, I'm always interested in experimental things and new ideas, but this book makes you read differently. You have to really put a piece of paper here so that you can read the words. I wanted to ask you, when I was reading it, did you ever have any one page that was all blank? Because you always...
I think the first page is, I think.
The first page.
I think so, yeah.
Because you usually find some words, and I was wondering, and sometimes you have whole sentences and even part of a sentence in another sentence.
Right, or the punctuation. Sometimes I would need a piece of punctuation.
But that's way down here.
Yeah, so I'd have to borrow it from some other sentence, so there'll just be a stray
Yeah,
semicolon, you know, right in the middle of the page. It was a wacky process.
So strange.
Yeah, it was fun. It was...
I could never do this. I guess that's why I really admire it, because I could never do this.
I'm sure you could. You'd never want to do it.
Well, I would find it so obsessive and bizarre that I'd become deranged.
Well, you remember what I used to be like that
Absolutely
before.
deranged.
Yeah. It was challenging. You know,
I don't think most people understand how challenging that was. He took a text that already existed and created a new story out of it by using just a few words on a page and dropping out all the others, but moving blindly. It was like you were moving across a floor, pushing a bean with your nose, and not really knowing whether you turned the page, whether you could find anything on the next page. You were very lucky because I noticed you found last day of life. You found those words on page 11. So this becomes a story about the last day of a life. But if you hadn't found those words on page 11, what would you have done?
we wouldn't be sitting here right now for one thing.
I mean, what if you just couldn't find those? You couldn't find a narrative. You might have done this forever. You'd never find your way out of a narrative. It seemed like a nightmare that somebody would sentence himself, a sort of masochistic nightmare.
Yeah.
But you did it, and it's actually very touching, and it's something that Bruno Schulz would have read with a kind of poignancy, because it's like a nephew of Bruno Schulz wrote another story which does relate to his story pretty much. But he would understand it, I think. But almost nobody could have done this, I think.
You should try it. I mean, it's now clear that you're very interested in the process. Do you ever do crossword puzzles, or?
No, I don't do crossword puzzles.
It's a little bit like the opposite of a crossword puzzle. Like instead of, instead of filling in the squares where you're given clues, you had to. It felt like I was moving in the other direction. There were no squares to fill in. I was creating the.
But you were creating a narrative almost by shaking dice. It was very hard to know how you could go forward.
It was a lot like, it was not so different in the process of writing that I described earlier, where, let's see what happens. I'm interested in these words. I think these relate. There's got to be some way to connect them up later. I'm going to play around with it. The very worst thing that happens is I printed out, I think, 12 copies of the book that I would take around, and if it didn't work here, I'd pick up the next one. And
well, that's why I wanted to ask you, did you have some dead ends where you had to back up?
Oh God, I mean,
You had
100 dead ends for every
Oh, really?
thing that worked, yeah.
Oh,
But it's the same with writing for me. When I'm composing, I have 100 dead ends for everything that works. People think that when you write a book, you are generating 300 pages of good work, when in fact, you are generating 1,000 pages of perfect crap, and then you carve out 300 pages that seem okay. It's a lot less impressive when you see everything when you see the sausage, being made.
Didn't you say that the sausage makers all uniformly said the one thing that they would never eat was sausage?
Well, it was actually hot dogs, and it was every farmer I met, they would sort of lean across the table at one point and say, "But I'll tell you what I would never eat is a hot dog."
Right.
I would stay away from hot dogs. If there's a takeaway from the book, stay away from hot dogs.
Well, to get back to this book again, did you have any other possible texts apart from Bruno Schulz?
I had originally thought I was going to try to do it with a dictionary. I thought that was a fantastic idea, both because conceptually it's so interesting. Carving a story out of language itself, and I like the idea of the images that are in a dictionary. And
Think of the stories, like a trillion stories. Well, since we spoke this afternoon, I did look up this website called Book Autopsies. And have you ever seen that? Book Autopsies, where he takes the OED, or he takes a big dictionary, and he sort of disembowels it and makes like a carving out of it. So There are some illustrations and there's some words, but it has 3 dimensions, of course. And I've never seen anything like that.
It's beautiful. It's an artist named Brian Detmer.
Brian Detmer, yeah.
Yeah, they're quite amazing.
They're really quite beautiful. They have a disemboweled look. They do look like they're autopsy. It's like the death of the book. That maybe people wouldn't have been doing this in the 19th century. Maybe it's something that's particularly of our time, that the book seems more like an artifact. Then another thing I thought about this book when I was reading it is that choosing Bruno Schulz, you were making a real decision, because Bruno Schulz died in a certain way. He died, there's pathos in his death, and also the story that he tells is a somewhat Kafkaesque fairy tale-like story. You could have chosen so many other different texts that were liberating.
James Patterson, or
It's set in the American West, or say Lady Chatterley's Lover, you know, where the ending, she's pregnant, they're going to run away together, like a whole new world, and the old world is dead, and Lawrence is taking you to a new world. But here, it's so steeped in the loss of Europe, the blood-saturated soil of Europe. You know, that you've gotten yourself into a kind of impasse. There's a father who becomes deranged, and in Bruno Schulz, he actually metamorphoses into a cockroach. He's obsessed with cockroaches, just sort of running around his shop, and then he starts to be described sort of looking like he's turning into a cockroach, and then at the end he's sort of like a cockroach. And this is 1933 when he was writing, and Kafka wrote The Metamorphosis in 1912. So I was also wondering why you would choose Bruno Schulz rather than going to Kafka. Kafka seems to me, and I hope I don't sound adversarial, but Kafka seems to me a greater artist. He lived, I don't know if he lived longer, but he did more things than Bruno Schulz did. He wrote several novels, and he did long stories. Whereas Bruno Schulz is much more of an intense, like a hothouse, extremely neurotic imagination compared to which Kafka is trying to do other things. So I was just wondering, if I were to choose between the two, without any hesitation, I would go to Kafka, and I'd work with Kafka, but you chose Bruno Schulz, and that seemed to be an interesting decision.
I think that extremely neurotic imagination works very well for this project, and the density of it. His sentences are more dense than Kafka's. They're more flamboyant, which...
More metaphors.
Yeah, the things that actually you might prefer about Kafka would make him more difficult to work with in this case.
That might be, yeah. Kafka in some strange way is not as hallucinatory as Bruno Schulz. I also like the sanitary, what is the...
Hourglass on the
hourglass
sign of
under the sign of it.
Right.
Sanitarium on the sign of the hourglass, yeah. Something like that. I like both of those books, but they both focus on the father, a disintegrating father. And again, that's very European. It's very like early 20th century European, where a son's destiny is bound up with a father, and the father is kind of disintegrating. And in America, for better or worse, we don't really have that sort of mythology. We have more a son or a daughter dissociating from the family and moving away, characteristically, traditionally going out west. But in Europe, you don't have that. The people seem to be stuck in their villages and stuck in their family homes. They stay under the sign of the patriarch, and they stay there, and they die, as they do in Kafka. Whereas in America, we have a more rapacious, energetic kind of imagination where the American Puritans, for instance, and their sons and daughters and generations after them, they actually went out west. I mean, they got away geographically. So I would find that more exciting, I guess, to work with a text that had that liberating or open imagination. So it's really not a question, more just sort of a comment. But you did make a wonderful statement. You said, if it were not for my family history, I'm not sure that I would have become a writer. And I would never say that about my family history. You know, that we're obviously very different people, and maybe that has something to do with this choice of Bruno Schulz.
It might. I mean, my family's history, I think, led me to writing, not because I wanted to write about my family's history, but because of the way that the family history was handled and the kinds of silences it generated, or very peculiar uses of language, the things that were circled around but never touched upon.
You said they were taboo.
Yeah, many taboos.
I was very surprised to hear that.
I've never met a Jewish person who came from a family that didn't have some kinds of storytelling taboos.
And there's a whole area of Jewish people, my own grandmother, who decided that it was so unspeakable that they would not speak of it, and they became non-Jews. They left behind all the tradition and left behind Europe, and just sort of pretended or aligned themselves with a kind of non-denominational, maybe Protestant American non-entity, you know. And that's one extreme. But the taboos, I think, are so powerful because you can't speak of them.
Yeah, they're also glaring. They're not subtly handled. I mean, now I'm not generalizing, just in my family. And I think what happens in a lot of Jewish families is a kind of very rambunctious humor takes the place of conversations that aren't being had. Yeah. It becomes like a sacrificial substitute. Like, I remember when I was a kid, we were on a long car drive from DC to New York. We would do it once a year. And we had just gotten onto 95 North, and my older brother was acting crazy, and I was acting crazy, and maybe my mom was acting crazy, and my dad pulled the car over 5 lanes to the shoulder, and he stopped the car, and he turned around and he said, you know, whatever's going on, let's just get it out of our systems right now, because we're not going to be able to make this drive with everybody going crazy like this, leaking it out over 6 hours. Let's just do it. No one's going to get in trouble. There will be no punishment. Whatever you have to say it, and then we're going to go.
We're all curious to know what was going on in the car.
So he turns to my mom. What is it? She says, well, I'm cranky. You did this thing. I'm feeling like this. Fine. He says, you're okay? I'm okay. Turns to my older brother. What's your problem? And he's, well, Jonathan's been annoying me, and the seatbelt's too tight, and I'm hungry. Fine, you finished? Yes, I'm finished. And then he turned to me, and I was like 3, maybe 4. And he said, what's wrong? And I said, fuck. And he said, all right, absolutely. Is that it? I said, no, not yet. And I said, you know, shit, cocksucker, fucker, bitch, like a long string. My dad said he didn't even know what some of these words meant that I said. And everybody laughed. Everybody started laughing. And I knew that it was funny. At that age, I knew that I was being funny.
That was good.
And what was funny was that I was saying words that we weren't supposed to say, but not words that we were really not supposed to say. You know, bad words are safe bad words, but we also had bad words that were actually bad words. And I think a lot of the kind of dinner table conversation and the tone of the humor that we had together was organized around good bad words as opposed to bad words, and a kind of a reverence that was safe and that we could almost rehearse the real conversations that we were never going to have. Yeah. And I feel like in my writing I actually have those conversations that we never had.
Yeah, and there's a whole aspect of your writing we really haven't talked about tonight, and that's the humor. There's so many really, really funny things, especially in Everything is Illuminated. The phenomenon of this Ukrainian travel guide, I guess you could call him, trying to speak English with a thesaurus and using words that are in some ways could be the correct words, but they're completely unidiomatic. It's very, very funny. The whole sense of humor. And I think this doesn't have humor in it. This is really very somber, and it's so as if that whole side of your personality was sort of put on hold and coming out tonight, maybe. Is there anything else that we should ask each other before we turn it over to the audience? Some glaring thing. Jonathan's been asked questions all day long, so I think he's getting a little weary. He may just sort of ask questions of the audience at this point. It is a strange feeling, isn't it, to come back to your old school and sort of be here. It seems like an anteroom of hell, that you've died and gone to some Hades or something, and you look out there and see your old classmates and your old self, and you're kind of sitting here. And
It's better than that. What's amazing to me is how little I remember. And I don't mean that as a judgment of the experience. I'm surprised that I can't remember the names of the dorms I lived in, by and large. I can't remember where, but 2 of them were. I really...
Where did you eat?
At Terrace, I remember that. Which is surprising given how I spent my time at Terrace. But...
How did you spend your time at Terrace?
No, it was a lot of... when you go into class and the board is filled from the previous class and the teacher erases it all?
Yeah.
That was like what my time at Terrace was like. Just erasing whatever had happened that day.
Well, I have one question for you. Did you ever feel, in terms of your writing or even your life, that you made some colossal mistake?
You have to be more specific.
Have you made a whole series of mistakes as one major mistake? Now, I was just curious. Because you said that you got in all these dead ends in the book, and somehow you kept on going. To me, one dead end would cause so much anxiety that I would feel that I didn't want to risk more dead ends. But often when writers are interviewed, they just say the positive things. I was influenced by this, I went here, I studied with so-and-so, and then my publisher and my agent. And everything is sort of golden and rosy. But life is not really like that. And people actually do make mistakes, and they have periods that are not so happy and so forth. And I was just wondering whether you could share with the audience any egregious errors that then they could avoid making.
I mean, what I most regret is my self-consciousness, but it wasn't ever in my power to change, or it never felt that way. But that's what has stood in the way of my working in the ways that I've wanted to.
Well, what do you mean by that? That you're so shy, or so?
That's part of it, and overly questioning and unnecessarily self-critical.
Well, you don't seem fearful of taking risks. I mean, you're not self-conscious in the sense. Some people can't risk making a mistake, and they don't want to be made a fool out of. But Norman Mailer said once, unless you're willing to be made a fool out of, you can't be a great writer, because he took a lot of risks, and it seemed that you did that.
Well, there are safe risks and there are dangerous risks. I happened to go to a concert the other night. It was Jay-Z and Kanye West, and I was invited, and I said, this is probably going to be a pretty culturally rich experience, anthropologically rich experience, which is exactly what someone like me would say. And Kanye West got on stage. So rap is probably the most masculine popular art form. It is arguably the most homophobic popular art form. He is arguably the most important rapper in the world, or one of the top 3, let's say. And he got on stage wearing a leather skirt. And I was so moved by that, actually. And I remember thinking as I watched him, there's a lesson to be learned in this.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I am always moved by people who are flamboyant. And it's something that I have regretted in my own life, that, I don't know, the way that I was raised or the way that I have decided to organize my life has pretty much prohibited a flamboyance except on the page. And
well, that's interesting. Do you want to tell the audience what you're working on now, or would you rather not?
Well, the way you posed it makes it hard to say. I would rather
Yes, I
not.
shouldn't have said that. Sometimes people don't. Sometimes people don't want to. They don't want to talk about what they're working on.
I guess it's better to keep working on it and see if it happens or
It's
not.
a secret and a mystery, so you just have to wait. Okay, does anyone have any questions for about, like, yes, ma'am, right here. Someone's coming with a mic. You want to wait a minute?
I really enjoy your writing. Thank you so much for what you've shared. And how has your writing affected your identity and the way you relate to others?
How has my writing affected my identity?
Yes, and the way you...
I have no idea. I mean, I'm not sure how I can answer that question. I just don't know. There's no other me to compare me to. You know, I don't know what I would be like if I were a lawyer. I just don't know. I know that, now this is in terms of how I relate to others. I know that in terms of how I relate to myself, if that expression even makes sense, it forces a kind of questioning that I don't think would exist if I were doing something else. Like the constant wondering if I'm wasting my time, the constant wondering if there's something else I should be doing. It's very possible I would feel the same thing if I spent my days differently, but I don't think I would. I do a lot of my writing in a cafe in my neighborhood against a wall of glass, just a very large floor-to-ceiling window. And on the other side, most days, there's this homeless guy who's just a neighborhood fixture who's asking for money. And so it occurs to me very often that, you know, I am a relatively able person. If I wanted to devote my life to making sure hungry people ate, it might matter a little bit. I could devote myself, you know, really locally and specifically, and it might matter a lot to a couple of people. And yet, instead, I spend time filling pages, or worse, cutting out of already filled pages. And
well, you might be writing, make money, and then give money to these organizations. I mean, it doesn't mean, it's not exclusively either or.
No, but it's hard to think of being committed to the act of writing with the interest of, it's not the best job to have if your interest was to ultimately become a philanthropist.
Good rationalization.
So I think it's a profession that begs an awful lot of difficult questions, and I like that, despite how hard it sometimes makes it to go to sleep at night. I like that I have to spend a lot of my time questioning how I spend my time.
Well, you should think that you're bearing witness for many people who can't speak for themselves. You're writing about people who are mute and voiceless and not even alive, and then eating animals. You're writing about animals and they have no language. I mean, there are a lot of things that writers and artists do that when you look carefully at it, it's really for the good of a community, you know, because not everybody is going to want to go out and do the research that you did for the factory farms or writing about the Holocaust and so forth. So you're sort of bringing news to people and expanding the spiritual community of people.
James Seawright, who was my sculpture professor when I was here, who's a great guy, said, and we have to put aside nonfiction now, just talking about novels and art. He said that a decent definition of art is it's the thing that has no use, it has no purpose. And as soon as it begins to have a purpose, it's no longer art, or at least an intended purpose. Because of course, once it goes into the world, you know, a Jackson Pollock painting can be understood politically, but the intended purpose. And he said a bridge can never be a work of art because people use it to move from one landmass to another. And architecture can never be art because it is.
That's not really true.
I'm not saying it's true.
They're beautiful bridges.
I think it's a very, I agree that it's not true.
Too dogmatic. It's too dogmatic.
I think it's an interesting way to think about things. I agree that it's not true. I agree that bridges can be...
Well, art can have use. I mean, you can say that art has use. The poems of Emily Dickinson might seem in one sense useless, but they so expand the human spirit. People who read them are touched and they discover things in themselves they didn't know were there, even though the writing is very, very difficult and obscure.
But do you think she wrote them to expand the human spirit of readers?
I think she did. Yeah. I think she had a very idealized and very romantic sense of a community that went beyond Amherst, Massachusetts. I think she felt she was connecting with the hearts beating out in the darkness, definitely. I think that's why people do write. There may be a loneliness and a solitude of writing, but you're communicating with other people. And when your novels are read by many, many more people than just university students and literary people, they're read by lots of other people. And I'm embarrassed to talk about myself a little bit, but one of my novels was chosen by the Oprah Book Club. And I had never had the experience of people who were reading in that way that literary people don't read, because I went to the Oprah television program and I met these women who had come, mostly all women, and they were hugging me, and some of them were crying, and one woman said, "If Miss Oates, if my daughter had read your novel, she wouldn't have committed suicide." And I felt my heart just was so touched by that, because like you, I spend my time writing, putting things on a page and certain paragraphing. These people are reading from the heart. They're reading to learn about their lives. They're reading because their own daughter committed suicide, and they're reading about other people's daughters. And they don't think of literature as rarefied and effete, but they think of it somehow as in this transcendental sort of community, and they're getting a lot out of it. People in prisons, for instance, put on Shakespeare. People at San Quentin put on the tragedies of Shakespeare. And you think, well, that's so strange. Why would they do that? They get a lot out of it. They put on Beckett's Waiting for Godot. It's very deep, because the people themselves don't have that language, but they have the feelings that the language engenders. Yes, Eric?
Thank you both for being here tonight and having this conversation with us. As someone who is also deeply interested in writing, I'm wondering when you felt you could first call yourself a writer.
That's a good question. I often still get embarrassed about it. My wife, will kick me under the table. I get very embarrassed about using my middle name. I don't know if you do.
What is your middle name?
Saffron.
No, I thought it was going to be something bizarre that I never heard of.
Like Adolf.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it was like a writerly costume. I started using it in your class, I think. I was always Jonathan Four my whole life. And then when I started writing, I became Jonathan Saffron Four.
Grandiosity.
I think so. It's really funny though. When I was in Spain for the summer before my first book came out, and I befriended a writer there, interesting older guy, a real drunk, and he never paid any attention to me. Didn't really want to talk to me. Wasn't interested. And one night at the end of a meal and some drinks, we ended up talking. And he said, "Tell me, what's your book about?" And I said, "Oh, it's about this." And I described the book, and he sort of glared. He said, "Yeah, that sounds fine." And I said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Jonathan Four." He said, "What name are you going to use on the book?" I said, "Jonathan Saffron Four." And he said, "That's going to be a great book." But I continue, for whatever reason, have some anxiety about calling myself a writer. I remember it felt giddy in the beginning when I used to. I wish I still felt that level of giddiness, but I think that it's a hard thing to admit to that ambition. It's a hard thing to say it without feeling presumptuous or just preposterous.
When you're coming back, say, on the airplane, and you have to fill out that form, it says occupation, what do you put down?
Jewish writer. No. I probably put the only thing that's worse than writer, which is author. I think I write author.
My friend Richard Ford has just left it blank, like nothing, because he's so embarrassed to write the word writer. But even more embarrassing would be poet.
That would be the apps, or just artist would probably be even worse than that.
Artiste. Artiste with the French,
Right.
Did you answer Eric's question?
I don't know. That's for Eric to decide.
I think many people who are writers are really embarrassed of it. And we write, we think of what we're doing as a writing process, but we don't think of the noun. Like, you're not necessarily a writer, but writing is something that you do. Maybe one or two more questions? Yes.
Your first book was rejected by publishers at first. What motivated you to keep trying to get it published?
Well, that I wanted it to be published more than anything else. If I had been indifferent to the ends, I would have given up. Well, it takes a long time to write a book, and you put a lot of energy into it, and it didn't feel right to give up on the process so quickly. I also started to become aware very quickly of how just fickle the publishing industry can be. My book was rejected by, 12 publishers, let's say. Some of the same publishers who rejected it bid on it when it was presented by a different agent.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, they said my assistant read it, and I was hungover or tired or whatever it was.
But what a nice feeling to think that the publishers who rejected it, when they saw that terrific front page review in the New York Times Book Review, and oh, oy vey, I missed it. I mean, that's really a nice feeling.
It's an okay feeling, but I don't blame them. I mean, they're very busy people. They get, how many manuscripts do you think are submitted to them every day? So
8,000?
a lot. So it ends up becoming a question of trusting other people's taste. Like it has to be because of the number of manuscripts that are submitted. So, if a book is submitted by a certain agent, it's going to be read in one way. If it's submitted by another agent, it'll be read in another way. And frankly, for most agents, it might not be read at all. So, success in the world doesn't correspond to the success of a book. Or at least not always, and not usually. I mean, look at the bestseller list on a given week. You wouldn't even want your name on most of those books. Maybe one, maybe two.
But another thing too, Jonathan, you put in some time and you paid your dues, so to speak. You were in New York, involved with, was it Conjunctions magazine? And you brought out a book, which I happen to have here, Convergence of Birds, which is about Joseph Cornell. So basically you had a couple of years where you were doing work, almost like selfless work in literature and in the field. It wasn't just that he was out in rural Montana and sent a manuscript in. He was right in New York City and meeting people. And you can't really underestimate the power of just being in a literary community.
Yes, although my agent took me out of a slush pile. I mean, which is...
Oh, really?
Yeah, I sent it on a Friday. And on Monday, I saw an email from her office, and I didn't even open it for a couple hours because I thought, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this, with the obvious rejection. So she is somebody else to whom I
didn't know that came out of the slush pile.
Yeah.
That sort of undercuts what I was just saying.
A little bit. That's why I mentioned it. Yeah.
Who knew? Well, since I carried this book, I carried all these books around to show people, so I'll ask Jonathan just to talk about it a little bit.
This was the first book I did.
The first book he did.
An anthology of writing inspired by Joseph Cornell, his bird boxes. James Seawright, actually, whose definition of art we hate, apparently, introduced
me. I don't hate it. I just thought it was incomplete. Did he help you with it? No,
but he introduced me to Cornell in that sculpture class, which was sculpture. We were making sculpture. We weren't critiquing sculpture. It wasn't art history. He began each class with a slideshow with the idea that in the course of the semester we'd get a kind of quick and dirty tour of the history of sculpture. And I went up to him at the end of one of the shows, which was toward the end of the semester, and I said, "Who was that slide you showed? What was that?" And it was a Cornell box. And then I think the next day I went to the art library
I see.
and started looking up some of his books, and I went to the New York museums and galleries that had his boxes, and I just became more and more interested in them. And a lot of what when I was thinking about becoming a writer, his influence on me played a very large role in that. I liked the idea of devoting my life to trying to make somebody else feel like his art made me feel.
Well, also, he's really a poet. and the side of you that's poetic. And he's not unlike Bruno Schultz, working with these luminous images.
And little self-contained worlds as well.
Self-contained, yeah. There's maybe just one final question.
For about 10 years, I was like a 90% vegetarian, like every once in a while, maybe a piece of chicken or possibly even a piece of meat. And about a year ago or less, I read your book and I decided no more meat, no more chicken. And then I began to examine and explore a little bit, and I found out that there are more and more places that are selling free-range and organic chicken and meat. Now, I still don't eat meat, but sometimes I eat chicken. When I swore after I finished your book I never would. So I'm wondering how you feel about free range and organic. It doesn't have all the things that you condemn in your book.
Well, as I said before, my book really isn't a case against meat. It's a case against meat as it is now produced, nearly universally. Nearly universally, not universally, because there are exceptions. This free-range stuff you're buying in a store, or you're buying it at a farmer's market, or what? So maybe it's what they say it is, maybe it's not. Probably it's not. For a couple of reasons. And you can choose to care about these or not. When I give you this answer, my point is not that you're wrong to eat it, you're right to eat it. There's no particular wrong or right. Or rather, it's a question of degrees that often come down to, that defy the kind of more logical argument that most of the book is taken up with. So these birds all have the same genetics, and the genetics destine them to be ill and to suffer. This is the reason why chickens, whether they're raised for KFC or raised for these free-range, organic, labels that are sold in Whole Foods kinds of markets, they're all slaughtered between 39 and 45 days, despite the fact that it's an animal that can live, 10 years. They slaughter them at that age because if they allowed them to grow any longer, they wouldn't be able to walk, and their bones would start to snap under the weight of these, the weights of the bodies that they've been bred to have, eating very little food, growing incredibly large, incredibly quickly. So, maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. They definitely have a better life than the kind of battery cage birds that from most factory farms. But you have to be careful about the terminology, because a lot of it is manipulative and a lot of it is just very, very baldly dishonest. So, for example, free-range eggs are the fastest growing sector of the food industry in America right now. Not just in New York and Berkeley, but the entire country. You couldn't find them in any supermarket probably 7-8 years ago. Now they sell them in gas stations everywhere. Free range is not legally defined. There is no kind of egg that you couldn't call free range if you wanted to. No one protects you as a consumer from buying the eggs of a battery hen that are called free range. So there's no reason to have faith in the descriptions of meat producers. And there are many reasons to be skeptical. They have enormous incentives to manipulate you. If you know a farmer at a farmer's market who, these guys now, they bring photo albums because they've sensed the skepticism of consumers. And I'm inclined to trust those people, especially if you ask if you can visit their farm, they're excited to show it to you. Not only willing, but excited. I don't eat those products, but my book has no qualms with them, and I have no particular qualms with them. I go on at some length in the book about why I don't eat them. It's a larger story to tell than one I can here. But you just have to be careful that, to the extent that it matters to you, that what you're buying is what you think you're buying.
So we may not be be able to have faith in free-range eggs, but we do have faith in the future of your career as a writer, and we look
Very
forward
nice. Well done.
to see your next project. Thank you.
Thank you.